I really want to thank the organizers for having me here, partly because in scientific, technological and management institutes, history is given a very low epistemological status. And I hope to awaken you up to think of history in other ways. And so the title of my talk, History Beyond Fact. The reason why I begin with this enigmatic title is because few of us know that the way we understand history today is something of what emerged in Europe in the 18th century, when history was put within the mold of being considered a science with a particular scientific method that emerged out of the Enlightenment tradition of the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, there were the positivists that told us that everything was about irrefutable facts and about objectivity in history, and anybody who did any history other than that would be a heretic. So obviously, when we moved into the 20th century, it became quite a challenge for historians to talk about history in absolutely objective ways. So though in the 20th century, a balanced approach about the way we do history emerged, the question that was bothering all of us was that can objectivity be really achieved? And the realization was that objectivity cannot really be achieved. It is desirable, of course, but it cannot really be achieved. And so we had historical accounts that told us about the fact that history should be considered as a kind of a continuous dialogue between the past and the present, and a continuous dialogue between the historian and his facts. Never her facts, of course, but his facts. So we had this famous historian that was E.H. Carr, who wrote about this. But then what about facts? How do you look for facts? And very few people realized that facts actually are those that are something like fish in a big ocean. Facts have to be looked for. Sometimes the ocean is huge and we don't find the facts over there. And sometimes what you find is that you're not really using the correct tackle to find the fish. So it was this very obsessive question of how does a historian find facts? And with this 19th century, 18th century obsession of looking at history as science, it became exceedingly difficult to find pure facts. So ultimately, by the end of the 20th century, there was not decision, but collective endeavor of historians to talk about all history is about interpretation. So there was philosopher, historian Anchor Schmidt, who tells us that it depends on where you stand. If you're writing within what is called a modern prism, then you would be looking towards facts and finding events behind facts. But if you are not writing in a modernist context, then you will be looking is constructed within the question of power. Power is really important. Power, not only ruling power, but power to control theory and power to also control method. So how we do history, how we practice history is entwined in power. We don't realize that, but history is about power. Nation states write histories because they want to regenerate a certain kind of identity for themselves. So when the colonial rulers told us about how to do history, because that was the craft of history writing that they taught us, they actually told us about political historical knowledge, and they gave us history textbooks that were all about wars and kings and dates and so on. When they got frustrated with the information that was available in our sources, they began to look at ancient Indian literature, and in ancient Indian literature they found heroes and they found the dominant classes, and so they started telling us about heroes and dominant classes. The nationalist historians were no different. They used the same methodological apparatus, and that is why we had textbooks that were so boring, full of dates, and much of it is what you must have grown up with. And therefore, some of you must have studied history in school, And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that all of us began our history textbooks, especially when we were reading about the political events, with the Alexander the Great's invasion of northwestern India. Just recollect. And the image that I'm showing you is actually an image that was published in the 18th century in a Persian text called the Shahnama. The Persians, of course, took this information from the Greeks, but the memory of Alexander's invasion of northwestern India was to tell us about his conversation with Brahmins on the banks of the river Sindhu. But just look at this. This picture shows you much less than what we really know. The invasion was about violence, but there's nothing of violence in the documentation. And in fact, if you really look at it closely, it is a conversation of dominance, right? It's a one-way conversation. And something that your textbooks didn't tell you about was that there were other ways of documenting. And the other ways of documenting was that none of the Indian literary texts talked about the Alexander's invasion. They actually talked about Yavanani, which was the writing of the Greeks, which was known in our grammatical texts like those of Panini. We knew about the Yavanas, that is the Greeks who were a mixed caste or a mixed jati, having interacted with the people. We knew about the Yavanas as degraded Kshatriyas. We also knew of the Yavanas as very great and knowledgeable people in the knowledge of astronomy. And in fact, they should be honored like rishis. So this kind of information in the Indian literary sources was actually telling you about the people and not about the invaders and not about the victors. The victors were nowhere visible in these sources, but we are not told about them. So the emphasis was much more on interactions in the sources that we had than about impositions. However, look at this. History, how frustrating can it get, folks? There's a lady historian standing in front of you, and we are all the time writing and researching only his story. So obviously, a great expansion had to be done in the way we looked at history. Of course, the reason why history is because a very famous English adage, some of you may know, we started our TED talk this morning with geographical issues. So the famous adage is about history is about chaps and geography is about maps. And so where is half of humanity, folks? Where is half of humanity? Half of humanity, women in particular, and more importantly, from my particular concern, where is the history of ordinary everyday activities? We hardly have any history in our textbooks about ordinary everyday activities of subordinate peoples, of farmers, of traders, of professionals, and of course of the laboring classes. So the unseen and the unspoken, it seems to me, were those that were not written about. The history was always of the victors. So how do we move forward? How do we move forward? We have to differentiate. My presentation is going to tell you about this. We have to differentiate between different types of history. Remembered history, recovered history, and invented history. And it is remembered history that I want to share with you, which would be what in the Indian context we call the Itihas Puran traditions. This history is the inherited historiography. It is the collective memory of a community, nation, or some other entity which we really need to focus on. The Orientalists, Indologists, archaeologists tell us about scripts that supposedly we had all lost, like for example Ashoka's inscriptions or the Shatvahana coins, and they came along and recovered that. But ultimately what they gave us was invented history. This is something that I have borrowed from a book entitled by the name Remembered, Recovered and Invented History by Bernard Lewis, who then tells us that history is so selective. It is only about national regenerations. It's only about celebration of great victories, and it's only about great events. So if we want to really take a look seriously at the collective historical consciousness, then we need to focus on what we call the collective historical consciousness. And the collective historical consciousness will be in direct opposition to the philosophy of history that is known to us in modernity. Now, I'm not saying that Itihas doesn't have an underlying ideological basis, but what Itihas does is that it is focused on a cyclic notion of time. It doesn't give importance to a historical event, but rather it gives importance to how order in society should be maintained, and when disorder emerges in society, then those past events which are relevant for a society, that's very important, only those should be represented. So in a sense, we have before us some kind of a struggle going on. I'm using this illustration of the Samudra Manthan, which some of you may have grown up with the myth of the Samudra Manthan, which is about the struggle between the gods and the demons for the pot of ambrosia, of nectar, of amrita. So here we have the good and the evil. And what we are talking about is the struggle between history and itihas. To my mind, we really should not be talking in binary terms, because in between the Samudra Manthan, there are also grey areas of existence. And there are grey areas. People are good, but they are also sometimes bad. People are bad, but they are also sometimes good. And therefore, the future of history should be drawing upon both itihas as well as history. And I have given at a glance illustration over here for all of you, just to summarize this part and move on to a solution. History is usually about linearity. Giving importance to a value is always written. Itihas is cyclic, it's about collective consciousness, and it is about memory. So therefore, the questions of imposition, questions of violence, etc. are dealt differently by both these two modes of historical writing. Ideology is very important for history. Sometimes ideology is to resurrect the ideal in a society. It is always combative. You will stick to your ideological position. It's always about closure. Whereas itihas is much more about meaning. It's about opening up. It's about debate. The other day, the President of India told us that by nature, we are argumentative Indians. And that comes from these traditions of argumentation. And if we do history, then I conclude, then we are asserting the ideology of a society and making it the real of historical past. That is, historical reality is the ideology of a society. On the other hand, if you favor itihas, then you're talking about meaning, and you're opening up texts and wanting to rewrite and reinterpret, as I would say. So are we very different from what E.H. Carr told us, that the past is not an alien land? It is a constant dialogue between the present and the past. The past is not really in the past, it's constantly in the present, and we have to engage with it. And as a professional historian then, I engaged with local history. I was telling everybody in the break that I came from Delhi. I got located in what is today Telangana, but was then Andhra Pradesh. And my local backyard was very important to understand local history. I thought we have to engage with people around us. And in this quotation from Beverly Kingston, we are emphasizing much more on what is the community, what is the historical source, and what is historical memory. So memory, empirical fact as well, all taken together. I illustrated with an example, and I would make use of this opportunity to tell everybody in this room that they should go and visit Nagarjun Sagar or Nagarjun Konda, which is not very far from here, about 350 kilometers, and you will see what I'm really talking about. What I'm really talking about is that in the early years of independence, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, had a dream. And the dream was to create temples of modern India, which was to create the big dams. And one of the locations was Nagarjun Sagar, the lower Krishna Valley. This would mean that there would be a total destruction of the archaeological and historical sites over there. It went ahead. What did the historians do? They resurrected all this archaeology, all this historical monumentation onto a hill, which was called Nagarjun Konda, and they have now made a museum there with a lot of artifacts, illustrations, inscriptions, etc. This is our hardcore historical information that we have been talking about in history, and this is now the facts of history found a new home in this Nagarjun Konda hill. But apart from the historian, there were the artists, there were the writers. And there were others who were interested in the wealth of what had happened at Nagarjunkonda. And one of those writers was a scholar called Mulk Raj Anand. Some of you may have heard about him. And he wrote a fictional narrative of what life would have been around Nagarjunkonda. And there he gave a fantastic, pulsating account of the Buddhist monks that visited the place. He talked about the Chenchus, who were the autochthonous communities living in the hills around the Krishna Valley, and he talked about the artists. And last but not least, he talked about those cosmopolitan Romans that were roaming around all over India during the early centuries of the Christian era. And then he penned down this story. Last part of this story was that you should tell your master. The Andhra Shilpan is telling the Ethiopian slave who came with the Roman, tell your master to visit other places of great historical works. And then the Roman said, can I have letters of introduction to all these places? And then the Andhra Shilpan said, you do not need letters of introduction in areas of silence. The point being made over here is, areas of silence become areas of silence if the historian doesn't interact with them. And just like the Roman artist who came and engaged with the community, all of us have to engage with our local pasts. And with that, I would like to end by suggesting to you, you will be confronted with various interpretations. We have dealt with the colonial interpretations, the nationalist interpretations, we have seen through them, we have critiqued them, then we have also questioned the absolutist Marxist interpretations, and we have given ourselves a kind of an image where historians should now write subaltern histories, they should write feminist histories, they should be writing histories which question all dominant interpretations of the past. And with that, we can generate new theories. And with that, we can warn ourselves from using history for political mobilization. Indeed, we have moved to perceive history beyond fact. And I would suggest then, a singular truth is not the real of the past. It is much more complicated. And friends, our lives are very complicated, and so we should look at history as a complicated enterprise, but nonetheless worth going into, because we are what our history is. Thank you very much.